Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Deportation Machine, America's Long History of Expelling Immigrants, by Adam Goodman, narrated by Robert Fass. And they have come for us, 2 of us and 4 of them, and I think, perhaps they are still human, and I ask them, when do you think this all began? Adrian Rich, Deportations. Introduction. Understanding the Machine. What kind of nation is the United States? Although celebrated in popular mythology as a nation of immigrants that has welcomed foreigners throughout its history, the United States has also deported nearly 57 million people since 1882. More than any other country in the world. During the last century, federal officials have deported more people from the land of freedom and opportunity than they have allowed to remain on a permanent basis. Yet we know little about the vast majority of these expulsions, which have taken place far from public view and without due process. The most visible of these have been the so-called formal deportations, often by order of an immigration judge. Barack Obama's administration formally deported some 3 million people in 8 years, and during the 2016 presidential election, Donald Trump promised to remove all of the undocumented immigrants who remained after taking office. But formal deportations represent only a small sliver of the total. More than 90% of all expulsions throughout U.S. history have been via an administrative process euphemistically referred to as voluntary departure. Similar to prosecutors in the criminal justice system relying on plea bargains, immigration authorities have depended on voluntary departure, making it seem like the best of all the bad options facing people who have been apprehended. Local, state, and federal officials have also waged concerted fear campaigns, causing an unknown number of others to self-deport, or pick up and leave without ever coming into contact with an immigration agent. Together, voluntary departures and self-deportations have minimized the federal government's deportation-related expenses and restricted immigrants' rights while achieving the same end, terrorizing communities amid what amounts to mass expulsion. Although scholars and the public have paid scant attention to these other means of deportation, these seemingly less severe methods have been central to immigration enforcement policy for most of the United States' history. This book explores the history of expulsion and exposes the various ways immigration authorities have forced, coerced, and scared people into leaving the United States from the late 19th century to the present. It reveals how public officials have assembled a well-oiled deportation machine, propelled by bureaucratic self-interest, as well as the concerns of local communities and private firms. It is a book about how authorities have used the machine's 3 expulsion mechanisms, formal deportation, voluntary departure, and self-deportation, to exert tremendous control over people's lives by determining who can enter the country and regulating who the state allows to remain. The machine has not always functioned smoothly or at peak capacity, but when it has run on all cylinders, undocumented immigrants, and even some authorized immigrants and U.S. citizens, have found themselves under an all-out physical and psychological assault. This, however, is also a book about how undocumented immigrants and their allies have endured, adapted, and resisted, taking to the streets and the courts to demand their constitutional rights and challenge what they have considered to be unjust laws and inhumane treatment. Ultimately, this is a book about power, about how people have exercised it and contested it, and about how both citizens and non-citizens have leveraged struggles over power to define what it means to be American. Expulsion has long served as a way for communities and nations to assert control over populations that fall within their borders. During the last 2 millennia, localities and countries around the world have banished foreigners, indigenous people, criminals, the poor, individuals with communicable diseases, and entire religious groups. Since its founding, the U.S. federal government has expelled people across international boundaries and violently relocated others within the nation. In 1798, the Alien and Sedition Acts gave the president the power to deport alien enemies in times of war, especially supporters of the French Revolution and anyone else believed to be a political radical. For more than a century after the nation's founding, state governments also had the authority to banish people. In the 1850s, the nativist Know Nothing Party called for, and in some cases implemented, state-level legislation authorizing the removal of Irish Catholics and paupers. From 1855 to 1857, Massachusetts authorities deported more than 4,000 people to Liverpool and different parts of British North America. The deportation of foreigners forms part of a longer continuum of projects of empire, exploitation, and forced migration throughout U.S. history. Over the course of the 19th century, the federal government repeatedly removed Native Americans from their lands, pushing more than 70,000 west of the Mississippi River as part of a settler colonialist project characterized by Anglo expansion and the subordination of indigenous people and Mexicans. Many thousands of Native Americans perished from famine and disease, among other hardships. Around the same time, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 authorized the forcible return of runaway slaves and levied fines on anyone who tried to hide them or help them escape. And from its establishment in 1816, the American Colonization Society advocated for the emigration or expulsion of the free black population from the United States, a cause promoted by founding father Thomas Jefferson and later Abraham Lincoln. Only in the last decades of the 19th century did a series of consequential congressional acts and Supreme Court decisions create the framework for a deportation machine under the exclusive control of a newly created federal immigration bureaucracy. Granting immigration officials the authority to formally expel also meant that they could use the threat of deportation to push people into the shadows, or, in some cases, out of the country altogether. This implicit power, as much as the ability to remove someone, constituted a key component of the expulsion apparatus. While federal authorities have formally deported more than 8 million people since 1892, the year they started recording statistics, they have expelled 6 times as many people via voluntary departure. What exactly are voluntary departures? In reality, there has been nothing voluntary about them. Rather, they have built upon the United States' long history of using coercion as a basic governing strategy. Unlike people who leave the country on their own volition, individuals who leave via voluntary departure do so in response to a direct administrative order from the federal government. The immigration bureaucracy started counting voluntary departures in 1927, when many scholars believed they began. Yet previously undiscovered archival records reveal that the strategy dates back to the first decade of the 20th century. Voluntary departures have typically occurred after an agent apprehended someone, coerced the person into agreeing to leave, and then physically removed the individual from the country soon thereafter, or confirmed their departure within a set period of time. Unlike formal deportations, which usually have entailed expensive hearings and extended detention stays for people charged with more serious crimes, voluntary departures have enabled low-level officials to use administrative orders to expedite the expulsion of people charged with immigration violations and other minor infractions. They have empowered agents on the border and investigators in immigrant communities to act as both judge and jury. They have allowed officials to deport people on the cheap and prevent immigration courts from getting backlogged. Immigrants have agreed to voluntary departure because the legal repercussions are not as harsh and entail fewer, if any, obstacles to re-entering the United States. Until recently, voluntary departures might not have even been recorded on a person's immigration record. By agreeing to leave, people have also minimized their time spent in detention, although doing so has come at a high cost, resulting in the restriction of their rights and precluding them from fighting their case before an immigration judge. Also, in many instances, immigrants coerced into leaving have had to pay their own way out of the country. When people have resisted signing a voluntary departure form, authorities have sometimes threatened them or tricked them into doing so, or even forged their signatures. Self-deportation, the machine's third expulsion mechanism, has received much attention in recent years, but it too is far from new. In fact, self-deportation's roots are older than the nation itself. In the middle of the 18th century, towns in colonial New England implemented a practice known as warning out to avoid having to provide for people in need of assistance and to exclude people who might be carrying infectious diseases like smallpox. A precursor of sorts to later self-deportation campaigns, warning out involved officials notifying newcomers that they had to leave town by a certain date or be subject to forcible removal by the constable. In some cases, people ignored these notices and remained in their communities. Others, however, decided to depart preemptively. One family unfamiliar with the practice of warning out before moving to Massachusetts was very much astonished when officials served them with a notice to leave. The following morning, after a sleepless night of deliberation, the husband told his wife, "I am going to pack up our things and go somewhere else, for this is no great of a place after all." Hundreds of others met a similar fate. Since the United States declared its independence, individuals in positions of power, as well as ordinary citizens, have continued to use fear in order to define who belongs to their communities and to determine who must leave. They have deployed dread to rally support for nativist policies and draconian enforcement actions based on a supposed Anglo-Protestant, law-abiding U.S. citizen us and a non-Anglo, non-Protestant, criminal, illegal alien them. Much of the fear has served as a tool of overt social control. Officials have long used everyday policing, immigration raids, and mass expulsion drives to remove unauthorized immigrants from the country, but they have also relied on the rumors and publicity blitzes surrounding these initiatives to spur self-deportation. Similar to other examples of racial violence in U.S. history, these campaigns may have targeted specific individuals or a relatively small number of people, but they have been meant to terrorize entire groups. Even when the threat of expulsion has not scared people into leaving, it has cast a shadow over much of the daily lives of millions. How important has expulsion been to the history of the United States? Most scholars' attention has gone to formal deportations during particular periods, limiting our ability to grasp deportation's magnitude and changing nature over time. This book is an attempt to see the deportation machine as a whole, looking at all of the forms of expulsion, together with the bureaucratic, capitalist, and racist imperatives that have driven them over nearly a century and a half. My work connects historical scholarship on the legal and policy foundations of expulsion to journalistic accounts and social scientific studies of the contemporary enforcement regime and resistance to such policies and practices. And, perhaps above all, the deportation machine argues that these various means of expulsion have been a central feature of American politics and life since before 1900, and particularly in the post-World War II era. The machine's contribution to the growth of state power is remarkable, as is its legacy of creating an exploitable immigrant labor force. Moreover, the malign energies that the machine has unleashed have fueled xenophobia and demonized Asians and Europeans, Mexicans and Central Americans, Arabs and Muslims. Yet examining expulsion over an extended time span makes something clear. Although Democratic and Republican administrations have targeted different immigrant groups, the history of deportation from the United States has been, for the most part, the history of removing Mexicans. Mexicans make up around half of the undocumented immigrant population in U.S. history, but they account for 9 out of every 10 deportees. This, of course, has much to do with the two countries' geographic proximity and intertwined histories of conquest and violence, labor recruitment and migration, economic relations, and family ties. But it also has to do with the distinctive method for deporting most Mexicans. Even though Mexicans removed through formal deportation far outnumber any other nationality, the expulsion of the overwhelming majority of Mexicans, most of whom had done nothing more than enter the country without inspection or overstay a visa, has come via voluntary departure and self-deportation. Many Mexicans have returned north after expulsion, in part because of the labor demand and higher wages offered in the United States, and in part because of their long-standing personal connections, as well as, until recently, the border's relative porousness. Immigration officials have deported many individuals on multiple occasions, sometimes while they attempted to cross the border, other times as they went about their business in a place they had lived for years or even decades. Some historians have described voluntary departures and self-deportation drives as part of a nod and wink agreement between immigration authorities and agricultural business interests that, for most of the 20th century, made it seem like the former was doing its job while keeping the latter happy by enabling a steady flow of disposable Mexican workers. However, these other means of deportation have been anything but superficial enforcement tactics. Repeated apprehensions, detentions, and deportations have affected Mexicans' material and psychological well-being, as has living in the United States under the constant threat of forcible separation from one's family. Over time, the machine has helped create and solidify the stereotype of Mexicans as prototypical illegal aliens. When I began working on this book a decade ago, the first person I went to see was Marion Smith, chief of the Historical Research Branch of the Department of Homeland Security's U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. That morning, in her office in a generic building located north of Washington, D.C.'s Union Station, Smith told me what a historian embarking on a new project hopes to never hear. Despite the wealth of materials documenting the Immigration Service's history, there were no records on voluntary departures, much less on self-deportations. There was nothing for me to look at. That was the whole point, she explained. The government's effort to streamline expulsions and cut enforcement expenses depended not only on reducing the use of detention and bypassing removal hearings, but also on minimizing the processing of apprehended immigrants and the voluminous records that would generate. How does one write a history of something designed to leave no paper trail? Compounding this challenge was the fact that the available federal immigration records at the National Archives only cover the period up to March 1957. Some agency files dated after that were destroyed, others are missing, and most of the rest remain unprocessed and therefore inaccessible. In any case, official accounts do not shed much light on expulsion's impact on those most affected, deportees and their families. Their voices and perspectives are largely absent from institutional records. Yet in the years that followed my meeting with Marion Smith, I discovered fragments of this undocumented history scattered across North America. Some popped up in frequently consulted collections in well-known archives, albeit usually in folders that at first glance didn't have anything to do with deportation. I found other key sources in obscure, far-flung places, from a storage unit in a building along the 110 freeway in downtown Los Angeles and the basement of the U.S. Federal District Court a few blocks away, to the cramped sixth-floor office of a legal aid organization next to the state capitol in Boston, from the back rooms of a century-old church on the south side of Chicago to the folksy National Border Patrol Museum in El Paso, Texas, from the plaza of a small town in the central western Mexican state of Jalisco to a tightly controlled government repository in an unmarked warehouse in Mexico City. I conducted archival research, crunched numbers from dozens of internal statistical reports, filed Freedom of Information Act requests, and interviewed migrants and deportees, their family members, lawyers, union organizers, and immigration officials. Eventually, the workings of the deportation machine and the experiences of the people it targeted came into view. The following chapters illustrate the great and often unrecognized lengths the country has gone to purge recent arrivals and long-term residents alike. They also show how people have fought back by identifying the machine's weak points and pressing on them. This is, therefore, a history of considerable consequence for citizens and non-citizens, families and local communities. It is a history that has shaped individuals' lives and the nation's trajectory. Both timely and timeless, it is a history we all must reckon with in order to understand the making of modern America. 1. Creating the mechanisms of expulsion at the turn of the 20th century. Charles Fayette McGlashan lived what some might call an exemplary 19th century American life. The sixth child and first son of a French-Canadian schoolteacher mother and a Scottish immigrant farmer father who loved music, Charles was born in Black Hawk Country in Wisconsin Territory on August 12, 1847, less than a year before the area became the 30th state of the Union. He spent part of his infancy in the 581-person town of Plymouth in Rock County. But the family soon loaded themselves and their possessions into an ox wagon and headed west, arriving in California in 1854. The gold rush having passed them by, the McGlashans lived modestly. Charles swept the floors of his Sonoma County school to help pay for his education. In 1872, at age 24, he married and moved to Truckee, a raucous railroad and logging town just north of Lake Tahoe, near the summit of the Sierra Nevada. McGlashan quickly became one of the town's most prominent citizens and remained so for the next 6 decades. When he died in January 1931, residents mourned the passing of the man they considered Truckee's patriarch. Today, he is celebrated as a hero and Renaissance man, an attorney and elected official, newspaper owner and editor, well-known historian and author, educator and inventor, and astronomer and entomologist with a personal collection of more than 20,000 butterflies. Most remembrances, however, make no mention of the fact that during his lifetime Charles McGlashan was best known, not just locally but throughout California, as a leading figure in the anti-Chinese movement, a nativist who pioneered a new method of effecting mass expulsion through self-deportation. McGlashan had many companions in his efforts to restrict immigration and remove people considered undesirable. From the 1880s to 1920s, industrialization and new transportation technologies facilitated the migration of 25 million Europeans and hundreds of thousands of Asians and Latin Americans to the United States, in addition to another 75 million people around the world. Though some people fled violence or moved to reunite with family, most crossed oceans and traversed continents in search of a better life. Employers did not simply need immigrant workers, they sought them out, dispatching recruiters to foreign countries in hopes of meeting the rapidly expanding labor demand in factories and mines, in fields, and on the railroads. The U.S. population more than doubled, going from 50 million to 106 million in just 4 decades. Unprecedented migration from places like China, Japan, Italy, Poland, and Russia, along with war against Germany, contributed to a surge in xenophobia and increased calls to control both entry into the country and who was allowed to remain. Over the course of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the United States, in concert with other nations around the world, took administrative, legislative, diplomatic, and judicial action to harden international borders and assert sovereignty. While states and localities had enforced immigration up until then, a series of congressional acts and Supreme Court decisions in the 1880s and 1890s gave the federal government exclusive authority and created a bureaucracy instilled with the singular power to admit, exclude, and expel. Officials soon began using photography, fingerprinting, and other technologies to standardize identification practices and admission procedures, and they established a passport system to document migrants and regulate movement. The United States also initiated a system of remote control, under which consular officials stationed abroad screened potential immigrants and prevented some people from ever leaving their country of origin. Though the federal government had the power to formally deport foreigners by 1891, doing so proved both cumbersome and expensive. Over time, concerns about the quality of new immigrants and their impact on the country led Congress to expand the number and types of deportable categories, making more people subject to expulsion and stretching the immigration bureaucracy beyond its limited capacity. Before long, individual officers took matters into their own hands, finding a variety of other ways to deport people from the United States. And not just officials. Ordinary people across the country continued to deploy violent and nonviolent means to coerce people into leaving as well, just as McGlashan and the residents of Truckee had. This chapter shows how citizens, immigration authorities, and legislators created and institutionalized the deportation machine's 3 interrelated expulsion mechanisms: self-deportation, formal deportation, and voluntary departure, during the formative decades around 1900. The machine did not always run efficiently or coherently, and sometimes immigrants' active resistance to deportation or officials' executive decisions to halt removals caused breakdowns. But the new means of expulsion expanded the fledgling immigration service's authority and reach in ways that scholars have yet to fully recognize. They also instilled low-level and high-level bureaucrats with the power to shape ideas about what it meant to be American along the lines of race and class, politics, and culture. Mechanism 1. Self-deportation. The anti-Chinese expulsion campaigns of the late 19th century. To understand the making of the modern deportation machine, we must start by examining the history of Chinese migration to the United States, the anti-Chinese campaigns of the late 19th century, and the actions of people like Charles McGlashan. Chinese migrants first arrived in large numbers after the discovery of gold in California in 1848. In the years ahead, growing demand for cheap labor in the West brought tens of thousands of people across the Pacific Ocean. Between 1850 and 1870, the Chinese population in the United States increased from around 750 to more than 63,000. A decade later, it topped 105,000. Nearly all of the Chinese in the country, 95% of them men, lived on the Pacific coast, mostly in California. They toiled as miners, cooks, cigar makers, lumberjacks, and laundrymen. They also laid tracks for the Transcontinental Railroad. Although Chinese labor proved essential to the growth of the United States during the second half of the 19th century, many Americans saw Chinese immigrants themselves as posing an existential threat to the nation. As early as the 1830s, the penny press, mass-produced newspapers that sold for a cent, described and depicted Chinese people as a distinct race of unassimilable heathens. By the time migration picked up in the 1850s, this stereotype was both firmly entrenched and pervasive.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?